Spoiler warning for the current everything of My Hero Academia. If you're not caught up on the anime and manga, I would suggest getting caught up before watching this. And content warnings for discussions of multiple different types of abuse, especially child and domestic abuse, and burnout and trauma in general. I tend to stick pretty broad to that kind of stuff, but it can be a little depressing if you're not in the right headspace. So please remember to take care of yourself. Hey guys, so if you're wondering where I've been, very long story. I don't feel like getting into it right now, but I'm back, and I'm going to continue this kind of unofficial series I've started with superheroes and neurodivergence. And the next thing I want to talk about is My Hero Academia, because it's so extremely autistic in how the world is built. It makes my brain go brr, and I need to talk about it. So I fell in love with this series from the first episode when we see Deku has a notebook where he details all these heroes' quirks and he analyzes their strengths and weaknesses, despite him himself being quirkless, which is kind of like a disability in this world, because in the My Hero Academia world, 80% of people have some sort of... It's not really a superpower, because quirk is the most accurate way to describe it. It's a thing that makes that it's like a metahuman ability thing. Sometimes it's just like changing eye color or having weird horns on your head or something like that. Sometimes it's like talking to animals or shooting electricity out of your fingertips or something classic comic booky like that. And sometimes it's really weird convoluted things like being soul-bound to like a dark manifestation of your shadow self, or like being able to rewind time for a specific person or stuff like that. So basically anything goes, and everybody has one of these abilities that vary in their degree of raw power and their utility and all that. So it's a very interesting world that can lead to a lot of very interesting scenarios. And I think quirks are a good way to describe neurodivergence to people as well, because a lot of people see autism as purely a deficit or purely a superpower, but it's not that simple. Like, the character Mirio is a great example that I turn to when I talk to people about this. So Mirio's superpower, we first meet him and we're like, oh, that's such a cool power, because he can like phase through solid objects. He can turn his body intangible, sink into the ground, and come shooting back up, and use that speed to punch people. And he, like, if you try to hit him, your fist will just phase right through him, and he's cool. But then we learn more about his backstory, and it turns out he got that way through years of intense training. Like, when his quirk first manifested, it was hard for him to control which parts of his body were intangible and which weren't. It takes a lot of coordination for him to do the feats that he does. And it took a lot of actually understanding how his quirk functions. So it wasn't just a given that he would be a great hero because he has this quirk. People thought he was pretty weak to start off with. And that's kind of my relationship with my own spicy brain. Like, when I was a kid, everything was overwhelming to me, and I had no idea what I was doing. It took a lot of strength just to survive. And it was only through educating myself and really coming to an understanding of my own body and my own mind that I'm able to use the different quirks of my personality to my advantage. So people's relationships with their quirks are very fluid and very different depending on their situation, what they want, like their goals and the support system around them. It's way more complicated than just. But I feel like this doesn't just apply to stuff like autism and ADHD and all that. I think it also applies to trauma. Like, as we're going into the war arc and things are heating up in the My Hero Academia universe, there's been glimmerings of it throughout the problems with Hero Society, and they really started getting traction when Stain showed up. But it's a very hard plot to explain. So for the uninitiated, I'm going to try my best. So Hero Society is very much celebrity culture. Like, heroes are both heroes have the danger of being an emergency first responder, and they also have the social risk of being a celebrity. And those two things combined make hero life very difficult, and also leads to some so-called heroes not being very heroic. Like, one of the biggest examples is Endeavor. Endeavor Todoroki is the number 2 hero who becomes the number 1 hero after All Might retires. And he got to this position in the most horrific way. He basically had an arranged marriage. He has a fire quirk. He can produce flames. And he married somebody with an ice quirk. Not for love, but because their quirks complemented each other. And quirks are semi-genetic, like people take traits from the quirks of both of their parents, and sometimes they combine to create a new quirk, which is why there are some really convoluted powers. So, he figured with his fire and her ice, they would make the most powerful babies. And he ended up having 4 kids, but only one of those kids had the fire-ice combination that he wanted. So he neglected his other 3 kids and horrifically abused the 4th, and also abused his wife physically and emotionally. It's heavily implied that there's marital rape involved. And eventually, she gets so unstable that she burns her child's face and has to be put in a mental hospital. So, his family situation is a garbage fire. And yet, he is the number 2 hero. He saves many lives. Well, number 1 hero now. He's genuinely very good at his job, and he's one of the most powerful people in terms of raw firepower, literally, and very important in taking down the current villains. Like, he's an important piece of the puzzle. I did not mean for that to be a joke, but this is not the kind of person who you think of when you think of a hero. And then there's Shigaraki, the main villain, who is the victim of several generations worth of trauma. His grandmother is part of a long line of people who have this. Okay, so most quirks are very individual and kind of are stuck to you as, like, they're a part of your body, kind of like your hair or something. But they can't be transferred. Except for One for All and All for One, which were some of the first quirks created, and they're in constant, like, limbo battle with each other, kind of like good versus evil. One for All is a quirk that builds up power as it's passed on, and All for One is a quirk that allows the user to steal and transfer quirks. So Shigaraki's grandmother inherited One for All, and she became, like, one of the most powerful superheroes because of that. But this also made her a target for All for One, so she abandoned her son in order to be a hero. And this bitterness festers in her son, who eventually ends up being horrifically abusive to his entire family, including Shigaraki, which leads to, when his quirk manifests at around age 3 or 4 or 5, like how they usually do, he freaks out and is not able to control it. He has this bitterness and hatred inside of him because of how his father treated him. That doesn't excuse all the murders he's done since then, because you're always responsible for your own choices, especially once you're an adult. But he is the way he is because of the cycle of trauma created. There's this awesome book called The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate, which I really wish I could reference in more detail, but I borrowed it from the library, so I don't have the physical copy on me. So I'll just go by what I remember reading from it. So society is almost set up to create, and not only it's not completely unintentional either. We actually encourage and reward certain types of behavior that come from unaddressed trauma, like being ruthless as you climb the corporate ladder and not caring who you hurt along the way leads to people becoming billionaires. Or being an outright bully makes you more than qualified to be a cop or so there are elements of child abuse and these types of cycles that are normalized and encouraged. Why am I talking about trauma in a neurodivergence series? Well, because trauma really does reshape the way that your brain works and your relationship with your brain and body. It makes you disconnected from your emotional feelings, from your physical feelings. It makes you compartmentalize parts of yourself and shove them aside. It, especially early childhood trauma, even if it's not big things like being beat or something, even if it's something as seemingly simple as the absence of support, it changes the way that you see the world. And therefore it gives you a brain that is different than it would be with typical development. Even though that kind of brain is sadly normalized in today's society, it's not typical of the way that the human brain develops. Now, I don't think quirks are inherently traumatizing. I don't think that's what they're meant to represent. There are other superhero stories where the superpowers or metahuman abilities do represent trauma, and I will get into those in a future video. But My Hero Academia takes a more neutral view of metahuman abilities themselves. However, One for All and All for One and the struggle between them does create layers and cycles of trauma on both sides, even the supposed good side. Even if we look at the most recent carriers of One for All, which is All Might and his successor Deku, the main characters, their relationship is riddled with trauma. Like, Deku, when he first gets One for All, he literally shatters every bone in his body until he is able to control it. And he needs to work his way around this thing that is literally too big for him. And meanwhile, All Might, or Toshinori, is fading because he's been injured horribly in the fight against One for All and his creations. All for One, I meant. Sorry. That's one thing I don't like about the series, is All for One and One for All have such similar names that I'm constantly getting them mixed up. Anyway, he's lost half his organs, and so he is only able to do hero work for a short time. However, he keeps pushing himself past that limit because he feels like he has to, because the universe needs, the world needs a symbol of peace. He throws himself into saving people again and again, sometimes neglecting his duties. And he sets this example for Deku. And throughout the series, Deku pushes himself over and past his limits again and again, scarring his body and often nearly killing himself. And it is genuinely hard to watch. I had to take a break from watching it for a while because partially that and partially because of Endeavor's whole thing. But I don't know, I like how they've handled Endeavor's storyline so far. I might do a short video on that. But the point, even on the good side, there is a system that perpetuates trauma, which makes you think about what is good and what is evil. Like, if your idea of good is like saving lives and making sure that people are alive regardless of the state they're in, then yeah, maybe that all the heroes are just unequivocally good. But if your view of good and evil is that good reduces suffering, then it becomes... And Hero Society has also been very atomized. Like, all the heroes are ranked against each other, and a lot of the heroes take that ranking very seriously. So a lot of heroes tend to be pretty solitary when it comes to working. And this leads to heroes burning themselves out and dying horribly. But in Class A and Class B, in the students of UA High School, we're starting to see that change. They're working together much more than they are genuinely friends, and not just coworkers who go their separate ways. They are genuinely friends, and it's only when all of the heroes are working together that they stand And that's something that is one of the main contributors to systemic trauma, is isolation. Isolation is one of the key factors, is that when an abuser can isolate you from your support system, then they have like a ridiculous amount of control over every part of you. So the fact that modern society and hero society are so atomized and individualistic is starting to become a problem and a breeding ground for the types of trauma that lead to villains. And when I say atomized, I mean well, a lot of this is US centric. Okay, there's some differences between the US and Japan. So I'm looking at things from a US lens, but trying to keep in mind the cultural differences. But one thing I've noticed is the same in both cultures is the work culture. Again, there's the heavy emphasis on climbing the corporate ladder, which is something that one can only do by themselves and would have to put down others in order to accomplish. There's this focus on appearances and professionalism and keeping up the aesthetics of doing your job, which is often more important than actually doing your job. There's also this tendency to define, and a lot of them kind of give up or royally screw up their personal lives in order to do their job. Like we've talked at length about look at how All Might responds when he first starts losing his power and eventually loses it completely and passes it completely on to Deku. He basically is like, my life is pretty much over, and he kind of is floundering for a while trying to figure out where he fits, and kind of he doesn't care much about his own life for a while, and he's just recently in the anime and manga chosen to live and enjoy retirement. But it was a long, hard decision for him to make. And then Hawks was recently horribly burned by Dobby, and his quirk is wings on his back, which was burned. So all of his wings, both of his wings, all of his feathers were completely burned, and now he needs to use prosthetics in order to have a fraction of the power that his quirk once gave him. And he's been making comments about how he's pathetic, and he's been really depressed and dejected because his hero job, which has been literally his entire life, is now something that he can't do. At least not in this. So this whole tying your identity up so entirely with your job, even if it's a job you enjoy, leads to people burning themselves out and dying. And I don't think My Hero Academia is meant to be a commentary on work culture. I think it's a lot of things at once, but I don't think it's specifically meant to be a commentary on work culture. This is just how I'm viewing things. Because I've come to a similar realization myself, where I've realized I can't keep putting my all into a job, because if I used the one for all at 100% all the time, I would shatter every bone in my body every time I sneezed. So, like Deku, I would have to be able to use the amount I need to get the job done without completely killing myself. And that's been a hard lesson for me to learn. And I've realized that a lot of the jobs that I thought I wanted when I was going to high school and college are things that would require me to use basically one for all at 100%. And that would have just completely killed my desire to be creative or to do anything, really. So I had to find a job that doesn't require me to put my all into everything I do, so that I have enough left for myself and my own life. Which is why I'm now a janitor instead of trying to be a copy editor or a newspaper writer or anything like that. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about careers and life in general, I think. And I think it's especially important for neurodivergent people for whom society is already not structured in our favor. And if we try to fit into the mold of neurotypical requirements or expectations, then it's gonna burn us out. We need to figure out what kind of hero we want to be, in short. Which is basically the message of My Hero Academia, is what kind of hero do you want to be? Not what kind of hero you think society wants you to be. What kind of hero do you want to be?